So here is a clip. It is the most important video that I have to show you. Hey team, and welcome back to the channel. Thanks for joining in. My name is Brian, core design engineer at Brunswick Bowling, and today we have a little bit of a different video for you guys. As you know, because you already clicked the thumbnail, this is going to be a little bit of a review of the history of the rule changes for hardness for bowling balls with the USBC and with the PBA as it relates to urethane bowling balls and the Purple Hammer in particular. And of course, because of that, it is the reason why we felt it was required for us to make a Purple Pearl urethane ball at 78D hardness. Now, of course, this is not going to be the performance review or the core review for the Purple Pearl 78D. So if you're looking for that video in particular, I am going to make that one. Look for it on my channel. But this is going to review some of the PBA and USBC decision-making processes over the last number of years and ultimately give you a perspective that I feel like is a little undertold in the bowling environment, and that is the perspective of the manufacturer. I, of course, the core design engineer for Hammer and a couple of the other brands at Brunswick. This is going to be a video that contains solely my opinion and the history and the facts of the case of the changes to the USBC and PBA rule sets. This isn't going to be reflective of Brunswick Bowling's opinion as a whole or the opinion of Hammer Bowling. I'm going to say that up front because I certainly have my own opinion about how this rule change set went down and some of the steps and missteps of some of the governing bodies. Now, of course, I'm going to try to be cordial and very matter of fact in this video. I'm not trying to say anything scandalous. I'm still a representative of my brands, but I want to say up front that this is a video based on my opinions. And unlike most of my videos, which are completely free-flowing off the top of my head, I did make a couple notes for this video, so strap in. It could be a little long-winded, but I hope the real hardcore bowling fans that are incredibly plugged into the sport can appreciate the perspective that I'm trying to bring for you guys. And we'll just start at the start for the Purple Hammer. That was in 2016 at the EBI plant in Hopkinsville. Remember, at the time, the long-standing rule for the USBC for hardness of bowling balls was 72 shore D. That was the limit, which is 1 point lower than the current limit right now. So when the Purple Pearl urethane formula was originally created, that limit was 72. In 2019 and 2020, the domination of urethane in the PBA and on USBC's major events was definitely in full swing, with the popularity of the Purple Hammer catching on over the course of 3 years by 2020. And so the USBC decided to conduct field study tests alongside the PBA at PBA events, and in particular the PBA USBC shared events such as the US Open. In their field study, they took a bunch of players' performance Purple Hammers and other urethane balls and even some reactive balls and just did field study hardness tests, effectively taking the balls that were in use, in play, in competition, and just punching them for hardness and gathering data. There was no rule being broken. There was just specifically a data collection idea from the USBC, mostly to research some of the grumblings that some of the competitors of the Hammer staffers were having trouble keeping up when urethane was in play. They were spot checking these at 68 hardness as a field level minimum. That was a number put in place for a number of reasons. One, the USBC, with limited research, knew that these balls were punching softer than the approved 72 rate, but also they didn't know exactly why. That's why they were collecting data. But on top of that, the 68 hardness rate was set as the field test limit, different from the 72 lab limit, because there are a lot of variabilities in the field that you simply can't control. We know that temperature and humidity can drastically change the punching softness of a bowling ball, and bowling centers are infamously bad at controlling the temperature and humidity in the building, so that was a major factor. But also the traveling of a durometer, even an expensive durometer from Rex that's on a stand built for bowling balls, can still have a lot of variability device to device. And that's not even accounting for the handheld durometers that get different punch angles and different spring rates and all of that stuff. So even when you travel with a very professional, high-level lab-grade setup, setting up multiple durometers or just breaking down and packing up and moving one durometer and setting it up in another location can have variability to the test. So the limit was set at 68 for the field test as the legal limit by which the players could use their equipment, and anything below that was flagged by the USBC for review for the USBC and for the PBA. Now that level of spot checking difference from 68 to 72, 4 points in total difference, not all accounted for by the softness of the oil on the ball, but also accounted for by the variation in the test procedure itself, should already raise some red flags about not the validity of the process, but the level of accuracy by which you can assume that the process is working. As a result, in the field testing in 2019 and 2020, the USBC elected to propose a rule in 2020 that would go into effect in 2022 that would jump the hardness in the lab setting from 72 to 73. This was a nice compromise, mostly because they were having difficulties replicating tests in a quote-unquote controlled environment out in the field where bowling was taking place. It really is a setup that is only successful in a lab environment, and so the consensus was that jumping the hardness from 72 to 73 would be a nice compromise where they could make the existing bowling balls harder without having to throw them out. And because they were being built at a higher hardness, then there wouldn't be a risk of the bowling balls falling below 68 in the field upon use. Now, of course, this wasn't overly satisfactory to some of the squeaky wheels in the industry that weren't particularly fond of battling the Purple Hammer week in and week out on tour. This is my opinion part of the video. This isn't the facts of the case part of the video. But the USBC did note in their findings when they did this research in 2020 that the performance hardness of the ball was affected greatly by the manufactured hardness. In other words, if you manufacture a ball at 72 and a ball at 73, there would be a performance advantage of the chemistry of the 72 ball over the 73 ball, albeit that variation would be very minute, but it would be a noticeable performance difference. They also made a point to note in their research paper in 2020 that the oil did not drastically impact the performance of the bowling ball. And if anything, even though the oil was lubricating the needle and making their punches softer in the field, it was also inhibiting the performance of the bowling ball or not making much of a difference at all. These tests, of course, were done over multiple urethane models, not just the Purple Pearl, but it is worth noting that there is a graph in their initial study, not just the 2025 summary. But if you do a deep dive of the original study findings in 2020, they will note that there is actually an increase in length of the ball before it hooks and a decrease in entry angle. In other words, a decrease in carry percentage due to the entry angle because of the lane shine of the oil on the ball. So in other words, the Purple Pearl urethane ball, because it has oil on the surface in the field, could punch softer but perform worse, according to the metrics that we use in the bowling industry as the standard for performance, which is total hook and entry angle. I'm going to take a quick aside here to say there were a couple major developments in 2022, one being that the 2016 and 2017 Purple Hammers were deemed illegal by the USBC and revoked from the USBC approved ball list at this time, and also the Storm Spectre reactive ball was deemed below the 72 hardness limit and revoked at this time in 2022. And the number of balls in the field for Storm, 7 of them I believe, were limited in USBC competition use. This was all in 2022, surrounding a flurry of field test hardness information and data collecting from both the USBC and the PBA. So in order to streamline this video timeline just a little bit, I'm going to talk more about those incidents and my opinion on them a little at the end. But to give you a more streamlined timeline, I'm going to jump ahead to the end of 2022, where Brunswick resubmitted the Purple Pearl at the 73 hardness spec, the new spec set by the USBC. This may have bothered some of the competition whose sole purpose for seeking out the USBC and the PBA to do some field testing research was to ensure that the competition wasn't at an unfair advantage, and the competition being us, submitting the Purple Pearl again at 73D hardness and passing all of the field checks set by the USBC on that particular ball might not have sat too well with them, but nonetheless the USBC approved this ball and has approved all of the spot checks since then.
Brunswick subsequently resubmitted the Purple Hammer for approval under its own manufacturing controls. and the product has passed all subsequent spot checks.
And in 2023, the USBC continued their research to get a better understanding of what the differences are on the impact of the footprint on the lane of urethane balls when they are dry and when they have oil on them, because that was a big factor of contention in the field testing when the balls were punching softer with lane oil on the ball and subsequently on the needle. So in 2023, the USBC came up with a clever little device that monitors the footprint of a ball. They have an etched glass slide that you can place the bowling ball on. It gives you a little footprint of the bowling ball in a stationary environment. When you put a dry, surfaced, unused box finish ball on, you can measure the footprint. You can use that bowling ball or apply oil to it and then apply it to the same device that measures the footprint and see the difference with and without oil. The USBC's conclusion was pretty simple. If the ball is manufactured softer, then the footprint is noticeably larger, and therefore the larger footprint would have an impact on performance, and the implication is that impact would be a positive impact for the user. In other words, a ball manufactured softer might hook more or slow down better or change directions harder at the back of the lane. Those are the implications of having a larger footprint. What they also found in that exact same research is that there wasn't a huge impact on oil being on the cover in terms of the footprint. The correlation between the amount of oil on the ball and the size of the footprint did not necessarily correlate with the hardness data that they were seeing. In other words, the ball was punching much softer with oil on the surface of the ball, but the footprint size did not really change much, if at all. In fact, I'm going to roll a clip here. I'm going to show you USBC's exact statement in summary that they said in 2025. This is pertaining to their 2023 research.
So we took these purple hammers, these pitch blacks, we throw them down the lane 200 times until we see the hardness drop. We put them back on the footprint gauge. And the readings with the footprint gauge are a little bit larger. They were about 8 thousandths larger in our research report. But you could also tell, you could see in the images the oil, the residue on the ball. It made the circles appear a little bit larger and clearer on the measurement system. If you looked at how much the hardness dropped and how much the footprint increased, they were completely different than what the production would have changed.
Now, I don't want to be the one to say that there are particular people on the PBA who didn't align with USBC's conclusion, but there were some particular people on the PBA who didn't align with the USBC's conclusion. The PBA had been gearing up and doing their own tests over the last number of years from 2020 to 2024. And in 2023, they proposed to the manufacturer to eliminate any urethane bowling ball that was a 73 hardness and jump the urethane specification to 78 hardness on the PBA tour. The claim is that there was an unfair competitive advantage to bowling balls that were manufactured at a certain hardness but then perform in the field at a certain lower hardness. Now, there are a couple issues with this argument, the first of them being the argument that we just reviewed with the USBC. They explicitly said in research not 1 year prior to this that the data does not necessarily correlate to performance when it comes to oil on the surface of the ball or a used ball. In other words, you can punch a ball at 70 or 68 because of the oil on the surface of the bowling ball, lubricating the indenter needle and showing a softer reading, but that doesn't necessarily correlate to an increase in performance. The ball is not chemically softer, the ball is simply lubricated, and therefore it's actually going longer before slowing down off the end of the pattern, and its entry angle is worse because of its own carry down and effectively because of its lack of traction, its lack of contact between the actual ball chemistry and the surface of the lane. So the USBC stated in their research that there is no performance increase. In fact, their data says kind of the opposite, but the PBA was punching balls with softer numbers than the 72 or 73 limit in field testing and basically claiming that soft balls indicated performance increases. So those two statements are at odds. Now, the interesting thing about this ruling is that they proposed this in the middle of 2023 and they wanted to implement this, and in fact they did implement this for the start of the 2024 tour season. Well, that raises another issue as a manufacturer. Our timelines for new equipment and equipment development are far longer than a 5 or 6 month window. But not only that, because the rule was proposed at such a rapid succession, there wasn't really discourse between the manufacturer and the governing body, the PBA, for their PBA rule set. They will say that they talked to their expert panel, involved industry experts, and definitely got the players committee involved in their decision. But I think it's disingenuous to say that the manufacturers had a seat at the table until after the rule was effectively decided upon. They effectively pitched that they were throwing out one of our best-selling products and not allowing it to be registered on the PBA, saying that we had to effectively make another product that fit a different specification, even though all of their prior rules followed the USBC rule set. And at this time, the Purple Hammer that was approved under Brunswick's manufacturing facility was approved on the PBA. So this would have been the first time that the PBA revoked a product that was approved by the USBC, effectively splintering the rule set between the PBA and the USBC that had previously been uniform. When they selected 78, that's because they claimed to be punching balls that were as many as 4 points lower than the manufactured hardness. In other words, they were punching balls in the field at 68, which we already reviewed. The USBC was also seeing that at the time. So they selected 78 as a 5-point jump from the 73 legal limit, so that balls in the field that were full of oil were punching still above this limit. That seems reasonable enough, except for two major kinks in that argument that I'm going to explain right here. The first is, what is a urethane ball? And I'm not being facetious when I say that, because from our perspective as a manufacturer, we were required to know what balls were going to be governed by this rule and had to be 78 or harder, and what balls were considered reactive and weren't affected by this rule at all. And we also have plastic balls and other non-absorbing balls that were in the mix, and we also had some reactive balls with slower oil absorption characteristics that were also in the mix. So when the PBA brought us this rule less than 6 months from the start of the 2024 tour season, they really didn't have a way to define what they meant by a urethane ball. And I'm going to pull up one more graphic here. This is from our friends at Creating the Difference. These are 3 urethane balls in the field. One of them is microcell polymer. That's actually a motive technology. That ball absorbs oil relatively quickly, but not as fast as standard reactive bowling balls. Then on the other side here, you have the pitch black. This is considered by the industry to be a standard urethane bowling ball. However, the catch is, it is not by definition strictly a urethane bowling ball, because if you wipe oil on this bowling ball, or if you throw a shot with this bowling ball and put it in your bowling bag, you zip it up for 24 hours and you come back the next day, that oil will be all but absorbed off the surface of that bowling ball. The pitch black, while considered urethane, is an ultra slow absorbing material that actually does suck oil into the surface of the cover stock. By contrast, the Purple Pearl urethane is a true urethane blend. You can throw a shot on this ball, put it in your bowling bag, unzip it a week later for league, and oil will still be there. Albeit it will be dispersed on the cover of the bowling ball because oil migrates and there are some surface tension forces at play. But unless the oil got wiped off by the interior surface of your bag, then it will still be on the surface of the bowling ball a week later. This is a true urethane ball that does not absorb oil. So the question then becomes, if all 3 of these are considered urethane by the general jargon of the bowling community, where do we draw the line at what is and isn't urethane? And the PBA took this point with grace, came back with a proposal that they had to define it by oil absorption. And they gave a limit. They said 45 minutes at first. For the oil drop test that's defined in the SOP by the USBC, effectively you just drop a drop of oil on the ball and time it, and when that oil drop is completely absorbed, that is the time for oil absorption. But it is different than just smearing oil on the ball with your finger or throwing the ball down the lane through head oil. So the incremented dot has an oil absorption time. That has always been part of the SOP for USBC ball approval, so it was already a process that was in place. They just picked some times that worked for them to define where the cutoff between urethane and reactive is according to their oil absorption test. They proposed 45 minutes at first, and then came back and amended it to be 60 minutes after they realized the 45-minute time frame was actually capturing some low-level reactive balls and hard reactive spare ball type balls that were not intended to be affected by the rule, which, by the way, that's red flag number 2 if they're kind of circumventing what their time limit is to capture and not capture certain types of balls to fit the rule set kind of retroactively, but I digress from that point. Now, earlier I alluded to there being another issue with this rule set, and it comes down to the methodology itself. And I know that's a broad sweeping claim, but I'm going to show you a very important video in a second. But what I am saying is that both the USBC and the PBA use durometer stands and testing to effectively determine the hardness of the bowling ball. What they do is they place the ball on the durometer and they use a pull gauge to pull the indenter needle from the durometer into the surface of the bowling ball. Now, on the surface level, it's a very simple concept. If the indenter needle goes further into the ball is softer. If the indenter needle can't go very far into the bowling ball, then that ball is harder. And it gives you a digital readout of the exact measurement of the hardness of the ball. So it seems pretty simple, but the practice becomes complicated because surface contaminants or anything on the surface of the bowling ball can change the interaction of the needle with the ball. Now, herein lies my point. I already made it pretty clear that I take issue with the fact that the PBA is saying that the hardness drop is correlated to a performance increase. So for example, a 78 urethane ball going down to 74 doesn't necessarily make it a stronger bowling ball. The USBC says the exact opposite, that when the ball is full of oil and it's shinier and slicker, it actually goes longer and the entry angle is worse. So by all accounts, that is a worse performing bowling ball, even though in the field, if you test that bowling ball, it would be punching through the oil softer because the oil is lubricating the indenter and helping it cut through the surface of the bowling ball. You might be saying to yourself, no, these bowling balls that are older, they're just getting softer and it's the softness of the bowling ball that helps them perform. But here's the thing, a true urethane material only hardens as it cures. In fact, it cures at a logarithmic rate, meaning that it starts out super soft, basically squishable, and as it cures super fast. So in the plant, it'll gel, go from a liquid to a solid, wiggly solid, in a really rapid amount of time. And then it will cure at a very slow rate and get gradually harder for effectively the rest of its life. There comes a point pretty early on in a urethane system where the system stabilizes and it will effectively be the same measured hardness for the rest of its life, but it will creep in hardness for the duration of its life. Reactive bowling balls creep at a higher rate and get harder over time, and that's why they can become brittle and crack if you don't store them or if they're susceptible to temperatures and things like that. But urethane bowling balls will reach an ultimate hardness, it's called, a stable hardness, and effectively stay there with no contaminant or anything else introduced. Now, lane oil, among the dirt and the other things that you collect in the machine, is a contaminant. So when you're field testing used bowling balls, you have to have a very careful and very particular methodology to ensure that there isn't contaminant, lubricant, on the surface of the bowling ball that would affect the reading of the needle. In other words, my argument is that these bowling balls, they aren't getting softer. The system says they physically can't get softer. The properties of the material don't get softer. But what is happening is, with use, they've got lane oils in and among the surface of the bowling ball, and it is very difficult to get oil cleaned off of a bowling ball in order to test it. Everyone that's watching this video has thrown a urethane bowling ball down the lane, so you understand that after 5, 10, 20 shots, not only does the track area of a urethane bowling ball get oily, but you're starting to get oil all over the surface of the bowling ball. And even if you're wiping it with your chamois or your microfiber towel each time, you're not getting all of that oil off, and you've got a lane shine ball in a pretty quick amount of time. You can actually see the glossiness and the reflection in the light relative to the box finish. So in order to test these bowling balls for true hardness, you have to do an amazing amount of work to get the oil contaminant off the surface of the bowling ball. Now, If it was true that the bowling ball was getting softer and that the oil wasn't making it read softer, then you could put oil on the bowling ball and get relatively the same hardness. So here is a clip. It is the most important video that I have to show you. This is a clip from Perception versus Reality podcast on the Radical Bowling Facebook and YouTube page from 2023. It is episode 17 and it's still available on the Radical Bowling's live page if you want to go back and review it. This portion of the video starts at 30 minutes. It's inside the Brunswick lab. Our product specialist, Tim Gillick, is actually the one performing the test, and it shows you the same Purple Hammer, new in box with no surface preparation changes. New in box, no oil, no use, no drilling, no nothing. He's wearing gloves so as not to contaminate the surface. He punches this initial ball. It reads at 74.66. That is the initial hardness according to our stand durometer in the Brunswick lab. He then places a smear of oil, of Brunswick lane oil, on the ball in a particular ring, the ring that we're using to punch the ball. He punches the ball again with the oil still sitting on the surface of the bowling ball. In this case, he's punching through the lane oil to the surface of the bowling ball. In this exact case, the 10 punch average of the new ball was 74.66. The 10 punch average through the oil drops to 70.8. That's over a 3.8 point drop in hardness just by smearing oil on the surface of the ball. He hasn't moved the ball, he hasn't removed it from the room, he hasn't thrown a shot with the ball, he hasn't tampered with the surface in any way other than adding oil to the bowling ball, and we got almost a 4-point swing in hardness using the exact same testing method that's used to approve bowling balls and spot check them for hardness in the field. Now, here is the really important part of this video. In order to get oil off the surface of the bowling ball, you can't simply wipe it. You've got to use 99% isopropyl alcohol. The scrubbing of the paper towel is going to remove some of the oil and the alcohol is going to flash off the rest. Now you can't use 70% grocery store alcohol, and you can't even use like the 96.7 or whatever it is percent. You really have to use industrial grade, highly pure alcohol, because water or other contaminant in the lesser grade alcohol is going to be just another contaminant that you can't account for that could potentially lubricate or change the results. So with 99 grade IPA, all Tim does is wipe the surface of the ball with the alcohol twice. He does it once with a fresh paper towel, fresh IPA, and again with a second paper towel, second IPA. In between, he's changing gloves to avoid contamination of his fingers. And so all he's done here is just use alcohol to wipe and absorb the oil off the surface of the bowling ball back to its purest form. Now, this is a very critical point. In this test, he did not clean the needle. The USBC SOP would have you clean the needle, and what we've learned from this video since 2023 is that definitely the needle has to be cleaned to avoid contaminant. In this case, he left the oil from the previous test right on that needle and just started punching the bowling ball. The 10 punch average rebounds to 74.09. So we're within a half point of the original test, and that includes a couple soft punches of the first 10 punches where oil was still contaminating the needle and the punches were still soft. But you can watch the video in real time and watch the hardness climb from the mid 70s all the way back up to 74.8 or 74.6 by the end of his 10 punch sequence, the average being just a little lower than the original ball because the needle had oil in the first couple punches. It effectively self-cleaned itself on the surface of the bowling ball, resulting in a true hardness reading in the last set of punches at the end. All of that is to say that I strongly believe, and I'm not speaking for, again, the whole company or anything, but I and a number of people that I work with strongly believe that the PBA got this initial ruling incorrectly, and that it's not the performance of the soft ball, but it is actually the inherent chemical properties of the Purple Hammer that are an advantage over the competitors' bowling balls. We also, and I should be careful saying I also feel strongly that the rule was targeted toward a particular ball, that being the Purple Hammer, and to make things fair, the rule had to be extended to include all competitors' bowling balls to ensure, fairness and levelness across the board, which to their credit, if you're going to implement any rule, that of course is the way to do it. I don't take issue with the method of the rule. I take issue with the method of the measurement and the collection of the data that led to the implementation of the rule that they decided on. You know who else took issue with this rule in 2023 and into 2024 when the PBA implemented the 78 hardness rule for urethane bowling balls? The USBC. They looked at the previous data, the data that I just reviewed for you guys, and said that it doesn't coincide with a performance increase. They also called a ban of 73 hardness for all of its USBC members impractical to apply. And I have to agree that on a large scale, telling consumers who have been relying on a USBC product that has been approved since 2016 that it is suddenly no longer viable would be a hard sell for the USBC. And it is an interesting turn of events where we're at right now, because from 2024 until now, the opinion of the USBC has seemed to do an about face. What's interesting is they haven't done any more field research or lab research to back up their claims as to why they reversed course and decided that 73 hardness urethane balls were not permitted in a number of their top level events. But they did put out a survey that gauged public opinion and apparently collected that as a data point toward their decision-making process. The USBC posted this link to the survey to all of the bowl.com members, to the USBC members, to PBA players, and the like, following a set of comments that led the witness as to what their conclusion about the urethane issue was in 2025. So to me, this survey definitely felt like a conclusion in search of data to support it. Because, as stated before, and in their 2025 summary video of their own research, they repeat the claims that I've made in this video about all of their findings of their own research. So the only thing that changed about their research between 2024 and 2025, when they did an about face on their opinion of the legality of a 73 urethane ball, was that they surveyed what they considered to be popular opinion, aggregated the data in a way that would drive a data scientist crazy. And Luke Rosedal and others have other comments about how the USBC conducted this survey and conducted its compilation of results, so I won't get into that. Suffice it to say that the data is an opinion poll. I don't consider it a data point in the sense that it is like scientific evidence or scientific research. The scientific evidence and scientific research that they have conducted does not reach the conclusion that is popular opinion, and their popular opinion poll that they put out to support their claim was met with mixed reviews and, again, is not a scientific data point. It is just an opinion survey. So I feel strongly that they've conflated the opinion survey with scientific results, added them to their other scientific research, and then came about a conclusion based on the opinion of one or a few people at the USBC. And because the conclusion was foregone, then the results had to match that conclusion. We're reaching the conclusion here in this video, but I do want to point out a couple of things that the USBC has made pretty confusing along with the PBA. So I don't know if this will make this less confusing, but hopefully this point in the video can be a reference point for you to go back to and refresh yourself if you have any questions. A question regarding the approval of slow absorbing or urethane-like motions for the PBA and the USBC. They do the same SOP oil drop test to determine the oil absorption time of a bowling ball. The PBA oil absorption time to be considered a urethane ball is 60 minutes. If the oil drop absorbs faster than 60 minutes, it's considered reactive. If the oil drop absorbs in a longer time than 60 minutes, it takes longer than 60 minutes for that oil drop to disappear off the surface of the bowling ball, that is considered a urethane-like ball, and it's only subject to the 78 hardness urethane rule if it's a performance core that has enough differential in it. So there are some other little stipulations to consider so that spare balls and other bowling balls aren't captured. The USBC oil absorption limit time is 90 minutes because they were looking at a broader spectrum of bowling balls from more manufacturers, and they also had more to consider about what bowling balls would and would not be captured by the rule set. So the USBC oil drop test time cutoff is 90 minutes, an hour and a half. If that oil is absorbed off the surface of the ball in a faster duration of time than that, it is considered a reactive ball. And of course, if it sits on the surface of the ball for longer than 90 minutes, it will be considered a urethane-like ball and be subjected to the 78 hardness rule for any future approvals. Second, the USBC approval list for when you can use regular urethane ball, like your original Purple Hammers, when you can use 78 hardness urethane ball, such as the Purple Pearl 78D or your Black Hammer 78D, and when no urethane is allowed in competition at all, is a pretty confusing list that, even as plugged in as I am as an employee of Brunswick and an avid bowling fan, does get mixed up. So in lieu of rattling a bunch of things off for you to confuse yourself, I'm going to post a chart right here that you can go ahead and pause anytime you need to, and I'll make sure that the timestamp is listed so that you can scrub right to the right point in the video. And you can pause this video here, take a look at this chart, and know these are the times, these are the tournaments that you cannot use urethane at all, regardless of the hardness. These are the times, these are the tournaments where you can use 78 hardness urethane bowling balls, and in any other case, and in any other USBC event, unless the rules state otherwise for a particular local tournament or event, your 73 hardness urethane bowling balls are completely legal for use. So make sure you check your local rule set. If there's no particular rule pertaining to it that you can find, then it's more likely than not that you can use your 73D hardness urethane bowling ball, such as your Purple Hammer, in competition with no issues. The Purple Pearl Hammer is still legal in most cases. One little bonus piece of content I have for you guys: if you are with me all the way to the end, you notice that I said in 2022 there were some incidents that happened with the Purple Pearl and with the Storm Spectre, and I want to talk about those for just a second. In 2022, the USBC launched an investigation into the 2016 and 2017 Purple Hammers that were built in the Hopkinsville Ebonite plant in Kentucky. Those were eventually banned by the USBC on the grounds that they were built intentionally soft to the 72 hardness rule, and that not that they were all illegal, but that a statistically significant portion of them could be legal according to the data set based on the 2 test balls that were sent for USBC approval way back in 2016. Now, bear in mind that there were zero new 2016 and 2017 new in-box, unused, untouched Purple Pearls available for testing in 2022 when the USBC decided to implement this rule, meaning that they couldn't check in the field any new, unused, uncontaminated bowling balls, so they only could do field testing on used bowling balls with oil contaminant to make any decisions. Now, the ultimate decision was based on the USBC approval data, which was pretty close to the 73 limit on the balls that were submitted to the USBC, but ultimately they have no evidence of any bowling ball ever being under the legal USBC limit, and there's no real way to test that in the field in 2022, 2023, 2026 now, with old contaminated bowling balls, because the chain of custody of that bowling ball is unknown. You don't know what the care was like, what products have been put on it, whether for cleaning or for tampering or any of that. So it's a little out of the manufacturer's hands. And beyond that, the employees at Ebonite that now work for Brunswick are very adamant that under no circumstance was any ball manufactured illegally, but that was the court of public opinion that we weren't going to win against. So we just did an exchange program because we were still manufacturing Purple Hammers. Hopefully, if you fell into that, you were luckily reimbursed with a brand new Purple Pearl Purple Pin. And last but not least, I'll leave you with this little trinket. In March of 2022, SPI had their reactive storm Spectre revoked from the USBC list in quite the same way that the Purple Pearl was revoked. Storm quite the advocate that the 16 and 17 Purple Pearls were illegally soft, but very innocent in terms of their Spectre ball or any of the other 7 restricted balls on the USBC list in 2022 being illegal. They punched all of their balls in-house to prove that there were some durometer discrepancies and that if you cut the box finish off their bowling balls, then they were not illegal. Be that as it may, whether or not their polish was lubricating the indenter in the same way or not, it is USBC SOP policy that the box finish of the bowling ball is the test finish for the hardness test. So if it was their polish and that is their box finish, then it is the USBC's right to say that that polish is affecting the hardness of the bowling ball. A slightly different scenario than the Purple Pearl situation, but I'll tell you what makes it an incredibly different scenario from my perspective, and that is we're talking about a reactive ball. And as you guys know, aggressive reactive bowling balls, such as the Spectre, will absorb oil in a pretty aggressive amount of time. I mean, usually in, say, a 4 or 5 man league, if you throw a ball down the lane and you throw it through the most amount of head oil on your house shot and you get up the next time you're up after 5 other bowlers have gone, that oil is all but gone, if not gone, off the surface of that reactive bowling ball. So the dip in the reading of the hardness due to the needle being lubricated by the oil of a used bowling ball is incredibly less likely than it is on a urethane ball that's not absorbing that oil. If you give that bowling ball enough time, that oil should be soaked deep enough into the cover that it won't affect the hardness reading of a ball. That's why in field testing, reactive bowling balls very rarely show a decrease in softness with age. Just like urethane formulas, reactive formulas do not soften with age with no contaminant. If you build a urethane bowling ball and you build a reactive bowling ball and you set them on the shelf and you never subject them to oil, they will not get softer over time, they will get harder. With reactive bowling balls, you can test them in the field and get a relatively true, accurate measurement of hardness because the oil is absorbing off the surface of the cover stock. You will have some contaminant left over, trace amounts, that will affect the hardness reading a little bit, but not to the degree of a urethane ball, not even close. So there's a pretty drastic difference in the argument, in my opinion, between the field testing of the 2016 and 2017 Purple Hammers versus the field testing results of the Storm Spectre and the other 6 or 7 bowling balls that got listed as illegally soft. Alright guys, that was a long adventure, but if you're still with me, I hope you enjoyed this TED Talk. I hope you understand that it's not us that's making the USBC rules, but it is us that is making the tools that make you a competitive bowler. So because we're strapped to the 78D hardness rules that we don't necessarily agree with, we're going to continue putting products in the field that help you be as competitive as possible within the given rule set. Of course, we're always encouraging you to follow the USBC rules and the PBA rules as mandated by the governing bodies, and of course any local tournament rules as follows. We are for fair and competitive environments, and while we don't necessarily agree with the way the rules were mandated or the methodology behind them, we do agree that rules are rules and they should be followed. We're going to continue to make incredibly competitive products to help you bowl your best regardless of the rule set. And we did that by making you a 78D version of the Purple Pearl urethane. Now 78D is 78D, it's always going to be hard and a little on top of the lane, but we've got some performance tweaks that are going to nudge it a little closer to the original Purple Pearl than that black 78D hardness ball that we've got in the Hammer lineup. I would be really curious on your take about these hardness rules, how you felt about them when they were implemented, and how you feel about them now that they've been implemented for some time. If you have any questions, feel free to drop a comment below. I'm happy to respond. And of course, follow Bowling Buckosh on YouTube and on Facebook. And while you're here, make sure you check out my video on the performance of the Purple Pearl 78D from Hammer.